Uniting divided people. I love that we're coming together, Israelis and Americans, to have these very important conversations about our shared destiny, our peoplehood. What a fantastic way to honor the 8th day of Hanukkah. Before we get started with this session, I'm going to ask you to do something very important. Please turn off your phones. There will be a Q&A period at the end. Please be respectful. Don't use Q&A as an opportunity to make statements. Rather, let's ask questions from our expert panelists. Now, let's turn to our topic for this afternoon, a conversation with Ruth Messinger. Did I say that right?
Don't worry about it.
Okay. Oh. The Jewish people choose hybridity, moving beyond the binary and embracing universalism and particularism. In this session, the Forward CEO, Rachel Fishman Feddersen, will interview Ruth Messenger. In running AJWS for over 20 years, Messenger asked herself daily, for whom are we responsible? And how do we balance universalism with particularism? Ultimately, Messenger applied the particularist Jewish value of tikkun olam to universalist needs, such as helping women in Haiti who face the perils of sexual violence, gay men in Uganda who were persecuted for whom they loved, and garment workers in Cambodia who are not being paid a living wage. And the Jewish people followed. Be part of the experience as Messenger demonstrates how embracing hybridity brings the Jewish people together. Ruth Messenger is a social justice consultant and served as the president of the American Jewish World Service from 1998 to July 2016. I look forward to hearing more about what Ruth has to say in our upcoming discussion. Rachel Fishman Feddersen is the publisher and CEO of The Forward and has been an innovator in digital media since the earliest days of Silicon Valley. I invite you all, is this still on? Okay, I invite you all to go into the Z3 app by downloading Connects Me to read the full biographies of our distinguished guests. Thank you both for being here, and thank you for being here. I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I don't even know if this is working. Okay, so hold on. I'm going to lapel myself. Okay.
Yourself.
There we go. Am I audible? Okay, great. Great. Thank you. It is Messenger, right? I'm sorry. I should have just said that at the beginning. I apologize for not saying that. I know that because I moved to New York in the early 90s, and I was used to hearing about Ruth because she was Manhattan Borough president. And I heard Ruth's name all the time before she went to AJWS, and now, again, I hear your name all the time. So it's exciting for me to get to sit down with Ruth.
I just need to, since you all, most people here are Jewish, so this is a Jewish family story. I married into this family. My former husband, Olav Shalom, and his father and his uncle were public school principals in Brooklyn. And one was known as Mr. Messenger and one was known as Mr. Messinger. That's how the public school population of New York knew which one. And I made the terrible mistake one day of saying, well, which was the original one? And they both said mine. Anyway, the short, long answer is I was actually married into the Messinger half of the family. But if you're running for a public office and your name is Messenger, you just have to give it a go. So I became Messenger, and my children are Messinger. That's why it doesn't make any difference at all. See?
All right.
Do whatever you want.
Great. Okay. So, you know, everybody always wants to get some of Ruth's time because Ruth is so busy. So we're all fortunate to sit down with you today and hear a little bit about what makes you tick, what you think about big, important things. But I thought we could start with your roots a little bit and talk about your sort of personal history, going back to your childhood, and wondering, because we're talking about Israel. Sorry, I can't turn my head this way without bringing my jacket with me because I become inaudible. So I will try to remember to face this way. Can you remember your first awareness of something called Israel?
I can. Do you mind if I start with saying two other things?
Please do.
Okay. So first of all, I'm going to start this public presentation with the way in which, just in the last 6 months, I now start almost all of my public presentations, and that is to pay my respect and gratitude to the Ohlone people, who were the original occupiers of this land and this water, and it is their stewardship that allows us to continue to enjoy this space. That is a practice which I learned in Australia and New Zealand in 2008. It is now a common practice in Canada, and I feel embarrassed myself that as somebody who has worked on land rights issues with American Jewish World Service, that it took me 10 years to figure out that I could do it as well. But it is a way of reminding us that we are not the original owners or stewards of this land, that we owe respect to people who were, and that the importance of land and land rights is still a huge issue in the world today. And the second thing I want to say is, since we will talk a lot about American Jewish World Service, I would just like to call out in this room the person who hired me to be the CEO of American Jewish World Service, who is Don Abramson. Okay, now, so first recollection of it. So I think that's really a good question because I'm old. So I was born shortly after the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And so some people are still in this room, are still in my age cohort, but seriously, most are not. And it's dramatic how significant that is in terms of people's memory of Israel. So I was born in 1940. So I have probably a very vague memory of the establishment of the state. But for both the period before that, and certainly I think some people will disagree with me, but from my personal experience, the 5 or 10 years after that, basically the only mention of Israel was now the Jews had a state, but it was to be talked about by the people who were going to go there, or the people who were going to raise money for there. So I had a pushki from the Jewish National Fund, which, anyway, we'll talk about that some other time. But I do remember that. But it was a place which was to be cherished and revered, but it was to be really respected by the people who were moving there. And so then to go on in my household, so I was really raised with a focus on what it meant to be Jewish and what it meant to be Jewish in America. And to just finish up the Israel question, when my parents were not interested in making Aliyah, so my parents did not think about going to Israel until, as travelers, as visitors, until significantly later. So I don't remember when their first trip was, but it was after I was no longer a child. And then fast forward, I guess, I can't do the math as fast, but about 20 years, maybe more. So my parents took my 3 children and their other 2 grandchildren on 2 different trips to Israel before I went. So my kids went to Israel in about when they were 10, so that would be about the mid-1970s. And then my daughter made a decision to do her senior year of high school in Israel, and that was the first time that I went, so much, much later.
Mm-hmm. And was your family sort of strongly identified with being Jewish, or was it just a background thing? Like, tell us about that.
Okay, so I'd love to talk about this. First of all, I'd love to talk about my family. But what I most love to say is, because this is true for, I promise you, 60% of the people in this room, but you don't, because that's my test, but you don't think about it this way. My parents consciously set up a home that was more Jewish than the one they grew up in. And for reasons that I think is sort of tragic, we are people that are so connected to the really terrible stories of what has happened to us as a people that we never celebrate the moves in the other direction. So my mother grew up in a home in which my grandfather was a very important figure in the New York Jewish community, which I can talk about in a minute. But from the Jewish point of view, that is from the religious point of view, my mother's home was not religious because her mother was very busy assimilating. And my mother consciously went to set up a home that was more Jewish than the one she grew up in. I think it's more or less true for my dad. and were very serious about it, and it made a huge impact on me, and guess what? It made less of an impact on my sister. So, you know, who can ever predict these things? But when my mother was still alive, I told her that I wanted to write an oral history of her and the family's recollections of her because of how important she was to all of us. But I said to her that I wanted to do it about people who set up homes that were more Jewish than the one they grew up in, and she said, oh, that's not a story. And I was able to name in my own family. Okay, she did it to her parents. One of my children did it to me. I mean, I don't mean did it to me, but set up a home that was more Jewish than the one he grew up in. I have 3 children, and they belong to 4 synagogues: Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox. That's really true. But then I was able to name other parts of our family where that's also true. So I just want us to be sure that we celebrate that people at all over at different levels and different generations, people are choosing different ways to affirm their Judaism. Sometimes it's by the denomination, sometimes it's by how they keep their home, sometimes it's just about how much they talk about the importance of being Jewish, but there are lots and lots of examples of that. Mm-hmm. So can I keep going on this for a minute? Yeah. Okay. So the other thing that hugely influenced the Jewish home that my parents set up was my grandfather, my maternal grandfather. His name was, and I'm happy to say there's now, thank God, a Jewish historian who's going to write this story. But my maternal grandfather's name was Israel Edwin Goldwasser, was born in New York. Okay, if you figure out how old I am, that's surprising. On the Lower East Side in the 1880s. Went through City College, became a public school teacher and a public school principal. He was the principal of PS 20 when Jack Javits, Harry Golden, and Eddie Cantor all went there. He was contacted by the New York City Board of Education, which was virtually entirely Irish, and told that he was an impressive person and they wanted to make him a district superintendent, and he said he would be honored, and they said you will be the youngest person ever made a district superintendent, and he said he would be honored, and they said you will be the first Jew ever made a district superintendent, and he said he would be honored, and then they said, and you understand that means that's as far as you'll be able to go, and he said, I quit. That's basically true. Now, I would add to that my grandmother, this same grandmother, who I loved, but who was just desperate to have him make more money. He then accepted a position offered to him by Felix Warburg as the first executive director of Feddersen in New York, which was a position that he only held for 2 years. There's a lot of story about why he left when he did. I believe that my grandmother decided that he should go into business. But the consequence was that he was serious about his Judaism, about his philanthropy, about his role on several boards, about his work on behalf of the Jewish community the rest of his life. I have the tape of a radio show that he gave telling the American community and the American Jewish community that the American government was not allowing the St. Louis to land. He was a huge influence on my life. And the next piece of this story, and then I'm going to stop, is that my mother, who was his oldest child and was imbued with his level of consummate intelligence, went to graduate school, was busy figuring out what it meant to be Jewish, which was that it meant more to her than it did to her mother. But she was interested in being a philosopher. And she got a job at the opening of Queens College, teaching as a all but doctorate teacher of philosophy. And a month before, and she was doing that to support my father in graduate school. And a month before Queens College opened, the head of the department called her and said, thank you very much, but we found a man. So I want to say, to my mother's credit, Olam Shalom, she didn't tell us this story until 5 years before she died, because she thought we shouldn't know that level of discrimination, that it would just be, anyway, she didn't tell us. And miracle of miracles, my mother got a job. Now we'll test how old you are here. So how many people here ever listened to or watched The Eternal Light? Okay, a few old people, good. So my mother got a job as director of public relations, radio and television at the relatively new Jewish Theological Seminary. She worked there for 55 years, and she was, among other things, the co-producer of The Eternal Light, which I mentioned not only because I'm very proud of it, but because not that many people know it anymore, but it was, I think, without any question, to this day, the single best first radio and then television program about a particular faith run by a non-faith-based, non-cable national network. So to the credit of NBC Radio and NBC Television, they ran this program, which was basically for Jews, for a half an hour every Sunday. And people who are old enough, or if the rest of you ask your grandparents, people were told, you know, come home quickly, come upstairs, we have to listen to the eternal light. So because she was doing that work, I grew up in that atmosphere, and I want to say on behalf of the seminary at that time and its chancellor, who was Louis Finkelstein, it did a great deal to talk about Jewish social justice and Jewish obligation in the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I won't be as long with the other.
Well, so it just occurred to me, like, I'm just like, I could just listen. Great, super easy for me. But I realized I don't have any kind of timekeeper. I'm like, I'm not keeping track. So I guess you can give me a wave when it's time. Okay, because you're really not in my line of vision over there. You're like
I'm
totally
running up when we have to do something else, and we'll switch.
Thank you. But one of the reasons I asked is that I was aware that you had this deep, deep, strong Jewish history. And of course, you were at AJWS, but I know that your work has been to connect with the wider world, not particularly Israel. So I wanted to sort of establish that you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so, okay, but it came together in pieces. So you heard now some of the early history, and that grandfather and my mother and my dad were significant influences on me from a religious point of view, also an awareness of Israel, and was part of what my mother wrote about. But I would say that the seminary at that time was based on defining a piece of Judaism to the world, and it was, so what does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean? What do the holidays mean? What is all of that? And that was very important to me, and I believe that that is all of my root commitments to social justice come from my family, and they were a core part of the work that I tried to do, first in community organizing, and then in New York City politics. I did occasionally confuse people, which was too bad, because when they said, like, why do you do this work? I said, well, because I'm Jewish. And I want to say that that didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to Jews sometimes, which upset me. But when I got the job, thank you, Don, at American Jewish World Service, I had not, until that job was offered to me, I had not thought for a minute about working in the Jewish community. I had thought about, like, you take these social justice issues and you work on them wherever. You work on them in your own neighborhood, you run a settlement house, you work on them in city government. You take the issues that I worked on for 20 years in city government, which ranged from, literally from child welfare to tax abatement policy, and you go run an NGO. I knew I was going to run an NGO, not for profit, but imagine that. And with love and respect for American Jewish World Service, it was like, oh, this could be really interesting. This is a job, which I needed. This will totally change my horizons, because for 20 years my world was bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the east and the Hudson River on the west, just like a small area. And I could learn about, from an intense professional point of view, the rest of the world, which I literally only knew from the newspapers. And those things came to my mind first. And then came to my mind, it's like, okay, what does it mean to go work for a Jewish organization? And frankly, it meant, okay, you could take what you think Judaism is all about, and you get paid to talk about it to other people. So I don't know if you remember this, Don, but the very first board meeting, I said that I thought we should start a sort of a public education program to let more Jews know about AJWS. And the board said, well, what are you doing about that? And I said, well, I've given speeches at synagogues in San Diego, Boston, and Miami. And the board said, oh, my God, that's wonderful. How did you pick those cities? And I said, that's where my grandchildren are.
It's a good strategy. So what I would like to do, I think, when we think about this conference and about the kind of people who come to this gathering, who are very concerned with issues of justice and issues of Israel, I think that a lot of people who have not been Manhattan Borough President and run AJWS still are interested in being involved in the world and doing good. And just starting with that very broad question, do you have advice for people here on how to be more engaged with the world in general and with Israel in particular?
Yeah.
Two really big questions.
So the first thing I would say to Israelis and to Americans and to Israelis and Americans who are interested in working together, which is one of the themes of this conference, but I would say to people individually, not today, not this minute, but spend some time, however you do this, as part of a couple, with your children, on yourself by a mountaintop, trying to figure out which of this universe of issues that was just referenced in Rachel's question you care the most about. Okay, you might actually care the most about poverty in some part of San Francisco. You might care the most about making a difference on, don't laugh, a national policy on voting rights before we suppress the right of half the people in America to vote. You might care a lot about the nature of civil society organizations in Israel trying to address some of the problems there. You might care in either country, I just spoke about this in the last session, about the fact that each of our countries, in my opinion, obviously this is all my opinion, but in each of our countries is not living up to what I think are standards that Jews should respect with regard to immigrants and refugees. That doesn't mean that that's your issue. Your issue might be hunger, and there's hunger in both of our countries. So all I'm saying is spend some time, because I can talk about all of this, because I've been around for a long time. I worked in city politics on these issues for 20 years. I worked at American Jewish World Service, an organization I'd love to talk about in countries around the world, and I now do social justice work in 4 or 5 different organizations that are paying attention to different issues. But I'm saying for individuals, and your question is right, try to figure out what you're most passionate about before you start figuring out what you can do. Because any of the kinds of social change that we're talking about and that we will be talking about here takes a really long time. It doesn't take a long time to write a check, and that's great. And if you could write a few more checks this year, this is the 8th night of Hanukkah, write a few checks as a family instead of just buying gifts tonight, that would be really good. Spread some light into the world. But for making change, whatever you're going to do, which could be a regular contribution, it could be giving some of your time, it could be taking a class if you need it and then educating others to do similar work. It could be organizing in a community, it could be working in an issue or a partisan campaign. It takes time. Social change takes time. And you will only be able to do it if, in some ways, it's nourishing to you. And it's only going to be nourishing to you if it's something you know you care about. Larissa, I'm sorry, could you find me a Kleenex so I don't sniff through the whole? Thank you. So I think that's really a key piece of advice. And in a sense, that's sort of what's fascinating about this conference is people are coming both from different countries. Thank you, Serena. She's an AJWS Global Justice Fellow, the best. Somebody tell Larissa that you found it. But anyway, so that's really would be my first piece of advice. And the second piece of advice is we all need to think a little more than we do about what else we can do about giving. We are by and large, can't obviously speak to every single person in this room, but we are by and large a privileged group of people who enjoy a great many conveniences of life and a great many protections of our rights. And that is not true for the vast majority of people in the room, and it is not true for all Jews. So, and it's certainly not true for all Americans. So I guess that's the other thing I would say is just sort of, in addition to thinking about what you're most concerned about, think about what more might I do that would make some difference? What's the best, now that I know what issue I most care about, what's the best way of working on that issue for me? I used to say to people, it's a little cruel, but I used to say to people, like, if you can give money easily, then give time. And if you can give time easily, then give money. Which is just a way of saying, push yourself a little bit to think about what is the issue and what can I do? Serena came to the rescue, thank you. And what can I do, and what can I do myself? And I guess I want to say particularly, whatever it is you're doing, and some of you are probably already doing a great deal, spend some more time educating in your family about it. So I would say to people here, do all your nieces, nephews, cousins, children, grandchildren know what your charitable interests, volunteer interests are, and why? Do they know that you do those things partly as a Jew? This is something that families don't talk about enough. When my dad, Olav Shalom, died, I discovered, this is not a good practice, don't copy it, but I discovered that my father must have sent $5 to every single Jewish charity in New York every year. There must be 1,000 of them. But I mean, I had to deal with stacks of mail like this, and I could just tell. I mean, nobody ever said, I mean, not like he didn't do some thoughtful giving, he did, but it was like he couldn't refuse a request from a Jewish organization. It didn't matter what they did. I don't think he had any idea what they did. They worked at contrary purposes. I'm not saying he should have advertised that to me, but I'm saying I didn't know that, in a sense, that he thought that part of his way of being in the world was to give tzedakah on a constant and regular basis. It would have been interesting to me to know that. Kids should be given a chance to think seriously about causes that they might want to support. They will often not be your causes. But that's okay. We give each of our grandchildren $100 starting when they're 9. And we say, if you give this money to other causes during the course of the year and let us know what you gave to, we will give you more next year. And you have no idea what I've had to write checks to. Anyway, lots of animals. But I'm just saying, like, it doesn't matter what mechanism. We don't do that anymore. They're too grown up and they're too independent. But it's that notion. And just pass it on. One more thing I want to say about that, because I'm, as you might have gathered already, a little. I was interested. You were all at the plenary this morning. I'm still sorting out in my head, but I'm concerned about thinking more about this issue of nationalism versus patriotism versus how I stand on the use of those words. But for sure, what is happening in the world right now is a lot of pressure against people who have the most desperate needs to move. I don't think there is any group in the world, you can challenge me, but who knows that story better than Jews. It's in our Torah, it's in our history, it's the essence of the history of the Shoah. So I can't convince you all what to do about immigrants in our countries or immigrant rights, but I can ask you to make sure that the next 2 generations in your family know their families, know your family's immigrant story. Because my experience on campuses, Serena, you can tell me if you agree because you're on a campus for a long time, is 10 years ago when I started being on campuses and I would ask young Jews in Hillels, like, where does your family come from and what's their story? They only knew the country. Now, that's not true if they were children of survivors, okay, or grandchildren of survivors. Those young people know the entire story. But if they weren't, they would say, I think my grandmother comes from Poland, or my family was in Argentina. And I would say, well, okay, well, when did they get to Argentina? No idea. So I just feel like this is a powerful story that we owe our children and our grandchildren, is who came here. And then to push the point a little further is like, how did they get here? Which really means, were they documented? And many of them were not. They came with the good graces of the people at Ellis Island. They came because they outstayed their welcomes. The stories that we're hearing that are just supposed to shock us as Americans or shock us as Israelis. I know the Israeli African refugee story pretty well. This is all also our story, okay? I don't want to say that I know what Israel should do with Eritreans and Sudanese, but I do want to say those are people who walked across the Sinai Desert to enjoy the freedom of Israel. And how we're going to respond reflects on us as a people, which doesn't mean no borders, let everybody in, doesn't mean all of that. It just means, like, how do we respond? And we don't respond well if we don't know our own stories.
All right. Speaking of Israel, again, because we're talking about Israel, what are your thoughts on how, at this particular moment in time that you're describing, if people want to be, let's say we're in a time right now where being involved with Israel, although maybe not for everybody in this room, again, this is a conference people came to on Sunday about Israel, but in general, being involved with Israel can be challenging for, especially for younger Americans who are concerned about how to talk about it, how to think about it. Do you have advice for constructive involvement in Israel? Is this something you can address?
Well, let's just first be clear. I don't usually talk about this because I think learning how to be constructively involved in America and American politics, and then through AJWS how to understand the people of the 19 different countries in which we're privileged to work with people who are pursuing their own visions of justice, I think that's more than enough.
Right, I'm sort of dragging you to address Israel.
So, but I would say is actually the basic lesson, which none of us do well on any of the issues that I was talking about, this is a meta issue, is listen. Okay, so I want to talk about listening. Shema says listen. So I can venture to say that except for the extraordinarily psychologically well-grounded people in this room, who I assume are some, the last discussion/argument that you had with somebody, whether who was going to take the garbage out, or the future of Israel, or Donald Trump, or whatever, it doesn't matter what the subject was, what most of us do in a heated discussion is spend most of the time that the other person is talking thinking about what we are going to say next. I do it. You do it. You do it. It's like, but wait a minute. And then you say, okay, I won't. Right. And then they say, you're interrupting me. So then you say, okay, I won't interrupt you. And then you just keep developing the sentences and the paragraph in your mind. And those of you who have ever been in couples counseling, actually what couples counselors do is they say, okay, Rachel, you just heard Ruth say what she doesn't like about you. Can you repeat what she said? And it's an artificial exercise, but in some of these political arguments, it's not so crazy. So if you don't pick an issue, if you don't understand, I mean, actually this one I've done, so if you don't understand why the people in South Tel Aviv are troubled by the people at the bus station, ask them to explain what their experience is. If you don't know, if you think that it's okay that we're separating children from their families at the border of the United States, try to find out somebody who will defend it to you and just ask why. So listen means really listen. It means listen with humility. It means try to understand the issue from that person's point of view. I think in most instances, and I think that's fine, it won't change your mind, but it will make you understand that the other person is not an ogre, and it will make you understand that unless you can sort of talk to them and find some common issues, we're not going to really successfully address any of these issues. So that would be my first thing, is like listen, try to understand what it's like. I think most of the Americans here have been in Israel, but like reflect for a minute about your experiences in Israel and what looks different as a country being in Israel and then does in America, and the other way around. Okay, it's like, so it's just a question of all of these issues are immensely complicated. And all of us have like many, he's waving something at you, I can't read it.
Oh, it says 10 minutes.
Okay.
That means we'll take questions in a second.
The issues are complicated, and everyone here, this is a current word for those of you who are young and work with young people. I hate this word, but I love what it means. The word is intersectionality. It sounds to me like somebody's cutting up a cow or something. But what it does mean is that all of us have a lot of different identities. And how we approach issues in the Jewish community, as the Forward just did this week, as women, in a community which does not treat women properly, the professional Jewish community. If you want to challenge me later, I'd be delighted. To how we are as second generation, to how we are as people who have people who have, so Jews of color in our family, which I do. I mean, all of these issues, like you have to learn what it looks like to the other person. You have to learn more about who you are. You have to be able to understand who you are from different points of view in order to engage in these discussions most productively.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to hear, I was interested in the title of the talk, so I wanted to hear a little bit about what you mean by embracing the hybridity of universalism and particularism in the context of this conference.
Okay, well, I did tell the organizers of this conference that I wasn't sure I could talk in the context of this conference. I could just talk in the context of me. But for me, one of the exciting things about being Jewish is that it has such a powerful particularity and such a powerful universality. So it's a particular faith. It has this extraordinary history. You know, I like to say sometimes that the Jews' basis for argument is we wrote down every dispute that we ever had. You know, people are talking today about Hillel and Shammai. That's nothing. But I mean, all the different disputes. And so, like, you know, we have this wealth of history and Torah-based experience and rabbinic commentary and a universe of holidays and rituals and prayers, everybody their own. But it's a very particular and powerful faith that grabs its adherents and is, as we all know, some combination of a religion, a peoplehood, and a culture. I'm not going to get into that one. But at the same time, it is a faith that teaches, more often than anything else in the Torah, take care of the other and the stranger because you were once the stranger. Think about the rest of the world. Take your Judaism outside of the Holy Ark, outside of the congregation, away from the Bema, into the world, and what is it that you need to do there? And so for me, my whole life has been like, okay, am I balancing those two? And that means constantly running into people who are telling me I'm too much one way or too much the other way. But in American Jewish World Service, when we do education with rabbis, we say the goal for the rabbis that we're teaching, and then for those rabbis with their congregations, the goal is productive discomfort. And so for me, the tension between being particular and being universal is about productive discomfort, which I'm saying is if you're totally comfortable with your life, with your surroundings, with your job, with your family, with your religion, with your country, then push yourself a little harder.
Thank you for asking that question and framing this. I think I dove into the particular without explaining where we're starting from. Thank you for that question. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Could you? I'd love to hear a little bit about your time as Manhattan Borough President and maybe one or two of the issues you strove to work at that you feel you made some big strides.
I'd be delighted. So first of all, I'm going to start off by saying, because I'm in an uncharacteristically kind mood today. So I'm going to say, first of all, I loved, I'm not being funny, I'll get to that in a minute, but I loved city politics. I did not expect to run for office. I really took my Judaism to work on the west side of Manhattan, which if there are people from the west side of Manhattan, we can talk about that later, but it was an exciting challenge in the 60s and 70s when I was there to be working on social change, mostly had to do with housing and urban renewal and education. But I didn't expect to run for office, just like I didn't expect to end up in a Jewish organization. And these things sort of happened by accident. Someone asked me to run for the school board. I was involved in education, so I said yes. And to be honest with you, when I ran once I was on the school board, I was astounded at how little my elected officials who were being paid full-time to represent me at the federal, state, and city, how little they knew about the actual lives of many of the people in their district. And that's what convinced me to run for office. I'm so happy to tell you that I lost my first election. I wasn't happy when I lost it. I was on the school board. I ran for state assembly. I ran what I was subsequently told by outsiders, they certainly didn't tell me then, was by insiders, I'm sorry, was a really good grassroots race. They didn't tell me that then. But I lost by 73 votes. Now, why am I happy that I lost? Because I lost to somebody who went to the state assembly and then went to the United States Congress and is one of the smartest people in the Congress, and he is about to become the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. So it's a very good thing that Jerry Nadler, who had been in politics for 10 years before I stuck my toe in the water, beat me. And we are all going to benefit from his service to the country. We have already, but we're going to benefit even more, I think. He's a really thoughtful person. But once I got there, I loved it. And part of what I learned sort of ad hoc is what actually, more seriously, was what attracted me to being at American Jewish World Service and staying there. And that is I learned to listen to the people that I was representing. So I learned to really say to communities, I can't do everything you want, but tell me why you want me to do that. And I began to understand a lot more about just the way people in the city live. And you don't do that easily and automatically. And I want to say with a little less respect than I should to other office holders, they don't all do it. So it's not like you don't talk to people. You have to talk to, although right now in the States, you know, there's this whole style of elected officials of not holding town hall meetings because they think people are going to come out and heckle them, which they are. But they would heckle them less if they established a mode for, like, really, I want to listen to people, or really, like, you're a community group and I know I've done you grief and I want to learn about it. I learned a lot about that from the staff that I was fortunate to hire before I went to AJWS, where it was like sort of the core of their practice. And as a result, we were able to do some really good things, from the most mundane, like I will take significant credit for the fact that you can now walk, bike, skateboard, or whatever, almost all the way around the island of Manhattan, since you used to not be able to do it for more than a mile at a time. I didn't do all of it, but I put a lot of it into play, and it also exists except for the UN, which won't let us be outside of the UN and next to the river. But other than that, you can now do it all the way around the island. To much more, you know, governmental things. I really did spend a lot of time fighting tax abatements to developers, including Donald Trump. Anyway, so I loved it. I think politics and politics has been given an increasingly bad name, partly, sorry, by the media, which plays gotcha politics a huge amount of the time. Is just looking for ways to embarrass office holders, which makes it harder to hold office and much harder to stick your neck out. But I really had a great experience in doing things that weren't always popular. What I was starting to say was about other people, because this is a Jewish conference. So I told you before that occasionally people ask me why I stood for certain things, and I said because I'm Jewish, and then I discovered that even Jewish constituents didn't understand what I was talking about. That was really confusing to me. I never quite got over that. But I want to say on behalf of somebody with whom I fought for 8 years, whose name was Ed Koch. I mean, he was the mayor, that's true. I was a council member, but I disagreed with him on a great many issues, although we were of the same party. But I want to say to his credit that he was one of the first models I had about somebody sort of publicly saying, I do this because I'm Jewish. So we didn't come to the same conclusions by being Jewish, but he was perfectly willing as a Jew to talk about his origins and to say that some of his experiences growing up and some of his Jewish experiences had shaped how he thought about the world. And I think it is, as I reflect back on other people in executive office, no names mentioned right now, Ed Koch was extraordinary about appointing to positions, cabinets and departments, people who knew more than he did about the issue, which is sadly not true of many of the people who hold executive office in this country, is they appoint people who they think will not give them any trouble, and therefore they don't do very bold things. And I have nothing nice to say about Rudy Giuliani, not just that he beat me for mayor, but he's a horrible person.
Let's just get that out there. We don't want the session to go out saying that.
Sorry.
Yes, and then yes. Mm-hmm.
As you're saying, there's so many problems in the world, so many causes that one can choose. How does AJWS choose where it's going to work and what it's going to do? And do you think any changes should be made in that?
Okay, I love that question because, so at the beginning, don't listen to this, Don. At the beginning, we were so small that my strategy for, which I might not have ever articulated to the board, but my strategy for growing the organization for the first 6 or 8 years I was there was just to say yes to everything. So, you know, staff members said, oh, there's a great project in another country. We met them at a conference. We think we can help them. And we said yes to a lot of things, and we did a lot of collaborative work with other organizations around the world, other faith-based organizations, and it wasn't a bad strategy for a very small organization. But in the last 12 years, American Jewish World Service has been increasingly serious about having and sticking to a strategic plan and actually eliminating programs that didn't fit with that plan. And what we are about, so it's important to say this, so thank you for giving me this opportunity, is first of all, limiting the number of countries. That's just because we can't be every place. And in choosing countries, we don't choose some countries that are either so much at war internally or such hostile places for Americans or for Jews that we can't work there. But other than that, we have no fear or favor. So we work in Muslim countries, we work in African countries, we work in South, so we pretty much around the world for 19 countries, not bad. All of Central America, not South America, significantly in both East Africa and West Africa, huge programs in India and several other programs in South Asia, Laos, not Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Burma. So we pick the countries, and now, because we're strategic, we pick very carefully the issues on which we work, which are human rights issues. So we are an organization that responds to world disasters, but we are not a relief organization. We are a human rights and development organization, and we're looking for people who are making social change. So reproductive health and rights to expand the rights of women and girls and LGBTI populations. Civil and political rights, so people who are fighting against or after Sri Lanka after a civil war, trying to rebuild their country. And then the area that connects to how I started this hour, and that is land, water, and climate justice issues around the world. And so we're looking in any given country where we work, we are defining that we work in one or two, only in Haiti do we do all three, so one or two of those three rights areas. And then within that, we look for groups, almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them started by local people. And we work very hard and in a somewhat disciplined fashion to find out from people what is their vision of justice, what it is that we could help them with. And by and large, that's how we determine our support. I think it's hugely strategic. Increasingly, the groups that we support are groups that are themselves choosing to be advocacy organizations, that is to take on their own governments or to create or to join social movements. We're supporters of something called Via Campesina, which is an organization of peasant farmers around the world that helps different groups help each other. And we take our issues to Washington. We have a Washington office, we never tell anybody how small it is, that does really good intergroup work, interfaith work on key issues where we can reach and make contact with members of Congress and members of the State Department. So I think it's very strategic. The current president and CEO, I hope for a long time, is Robert Bank, who was my executive vice president and who is the person credited with the increased strategicness, that's not a word, with the focus that I just described to you about thinking strategically. And it's now a $40 million organization. It was a $2.8 million organization when I came. So it's given about $400 million in grants around the world to organizations. And although I'm not going to do this now, I want to say that we have a lot, we do serious evaluation work now. And we have several amazing stories to our credit of people who've sort of actually made huge change in the world and won recent court cases, mostly around the right to land. As I said in the last session, so just by way of education, yesterday was Human Rights Shabbat because tomorrow is Human Rights Day, but today is Human Rights Defenders Day. And many of the people that we support are people who are so out on the front lines on both land issues and LGBTI issues in advancing human rights that they have lost their lives. So we're defending people who really stand up for what they believe in. Then you asked about change. So the only thing that I would change is I wish we had more money to do more Washington advocacy and more money to do more education in the Jewish community.
Thanks. I think we ran out of time. I'm sorry. Sorry, everybody. Thank you.